Hello watch enthusiasts. Now today I'd like to talk about several watches in various price points which have been released in the past month, which I found rather interesting in terms of their choice to be produced, and indeed a certain degree of controversy in the various releases, and indeed in terms of the choices of the brands to manufacture them. And also several interesting pieces that are limited editions, which I found quite interesting as well, and which I think have been overlooked a little bit, and haven't been talked about too much, but which I think mark interesting departures for their respective brands. However, before I begin this video, I would like to invite you all to join me on the social media platform Snups at The Watch Guys, a group set up specifically for you, my viewers, to discuss matters of horology with me, and indeed other enthusiasts, as well as giving you the ability to ask any questions and suggest video themes and topics that you would find interesting. Therefore, I do feel this will allow you a greater role in the production of my videos, and hopefully enhance the viewer experience. Therefore, I really would encourage you to join me and the other members at the link down below. Now, the first watches I'd like to talk about are from Christopher Ward, and they've released 3 new limited editions of their Trident Diver, which I would think is their most popular dive watch, and indeed probably their most popular watch as a whole. But this version takes from the original version, the non-GMT, non-in-house version, and creates a watch which I think as a whole, a package as a whole, offers incredible value for money. Now the models they've now released recently come in the form of 3 watches. All of them have the 43mm case of their new Trident Professional, with its new redesigned crown and slightly adjusted dial and so on. And prices have been risen to between £860 and £925 for the date version, as you can see here, with a white dial and that date, as well as having a red second-hand and an adjusted bezel insert with a red triangle at 12 o'clock. And there is also a day-date version of this in black or white, from £895 to £960, depending on the bracelet or strap option you choose. But the impressive thing about this is that they're offering a watch which has a Swiss movement, albeit a Sleater or an ETA movement, but that has been Chronometer certified, and the case is finished extremely finely, having handled one of these Tridents, with a very beautiful quality of brushing and polishing on the case, as well as that ceramic bezel insert, the very nicely finished and beveled crystal, as well as that very high water resistance. And they're offering this for under £1,000, which I feel is very, very impressive, considering the fact that, for instance, Oris have just released a new version of their Aquas, which comes in just under £2,000. And similarly, one's also seen models from, for instance, Squale, which don't offer the same quality, or at least rather the same variety of finishing on the case, and don't have the Chronometer certification this watch has, yet are substantially more expensive with the same water resistance. Which is why I do find that Christopher Ward are really reaching a point where they're producing watches which, though they're still seen as sort of a boutique brand, can really compete with the larger brands in a very, very big way. And this quality of the watch is again reflected in the hands and dial options, which are very, very nicely finished from hands which are polished in a sort of a curved fashion over the top of the hand, which gives these onion hands a really wonderful sheen in the light, as well as matching those very heavily raised and polished indices with that luminescent material in them. And similarly, the date window is very, very nicely windowed and framed in that in a steel polished window. And again, one has that wave pattern on the dial, which, though not entirely original because it's been seen on Omega Seamasters, does add an air of finesse, I think, to these watches that wouldn't be seen with a simple matte dial, and really could only be achieved with this or indeed an enamel-style dial. So as you can see, I'm really rather impressed by the fact that Christopher Ward are able to produce this watch for this price point, and indeed to the quality that they have quite clearly made it to. And having seen Christopher Ward Tridents in the past, the quality really was always there, even before these adjustments to, for instance, the crown, and indeed the bezel insert with those inset numerals, which really do add a wonderful depth to the bezel, as well as giving a slightly old-fashioned vibe with that red triangle, but whilst remaining a very contemporary watch with all the quality you would expect from such a brand. Now the next watch in this list is a watch based on the Sinn BLU1. And the Sinn BLU1 is a watch which I have the most immense respect for as far as professional dive watches go, because I do feel that the term tool watch is thrown around far too much, with watches such as the Tudor Black Bay being called a tool watch, which I must admit I don't think it is. But in this case, one has a watch which truly is a tool watch in its most pure respect. It's designed merely to do its job in most cases, with its simple black dial in its original format, with its fully tegmented submarine steel case, which is extremely corrosion resistant and also much, much harder than normal steel to scratch. And of course has that relatively utilitarian bead-blasted finish, which is really suitable for a watch of this toughness. This watch is also heavily anti-magnetic to 1000 Gauss, which is, I feel, again suitable for this watch, considering the depths this watch is designed for. This watch will quite possibly be subjected to magnetic fields from equipment being used by a technical diver, for example for welding or any other task that's needed to be done. So as a result, this watch truly is perfectly designed for what it's built to do. However, the model I'd like to talk about today is a new limited edition of 50, which has been released by Paige and Cooper. Now, Paige and Cooper are a UK-based brand and company which sells watches from less well-known brands that offer really tremendous watches at fantastic prices. And I've dealt with Paige and Cooper on several occasions, and I've been very impressed with their service in every situation. But they're releasing this watch to commemorate 5 years of collaboration with Sinn in terms of selling their watches in the UK. And of course, Sinn has also now appointed Paige and Cooper as their service centre in the UK, which again adds to the fact that these two brands are now heavily interconnected. And they've been working on this watch for quite a while, as has been stated by Paige and Cooper, and 50 of these watches are being made, with 35 being produced in this non-blackened steel, and then 15 being produced in the PVD or DLC coated black version. And the pricing for these watches, again, is dependent on whether you go for the normal bare or rather raw steel, or the PVD version, with prices of £1,850 or £2,250, depending on which you go for. And they do come on the bracelet that Sinn offers with their watches in matching steel. But the main article of these watches is that dial, which gives the watch the name BLU1, which is a gradient dial which required quite a lot of work from Sinn to produce in terms of having to retool or create tooling to make these, and develop a process to manufacture dials like this in this gradient, which is very difficult to do in terms of creating an even gradient of colour. Of course, I do rather like the style of this dial, which gives a really wonderful look to this watch as far as giving it I suppose a slightly more playful aesthetic than the standard, very professional style that these watches tend to go for. And of course I do like the play on the U1 being the blue one in this case. And of course these watches are water resistant to 1,000 metres, which is no mean feat. And in fact are water resistant to 1,250 if you consider the 25% overpressure these watches are designed to take, despite the fact that really no one could ever dive to that depth. I believe the record was 700 metres or so. So as a result, this watch is really overkill in terms of the performance it gives. But nonetheless, I feel it represents its technological prowess in that dial, with that wonderful gradient from the lighter waters down into the darker abyss, I suppose. Now the next watch I'd like to talk about, and indeed the final dive watch in this video, is the new IWC Aquatimer Automatic 2000, 35 years Ocean 2000. And this is a watch which has an incredibly long name, but is in fact quite similar to various other IWC models in the Aquatimer range. But this particular watch commemorates the 35th anniversary of the 1982 release of the IWC Porsche design Ocean 2000. And this was a watch that was made specifically for the German naval divers before being released to the general public. And it had a 42mm titanium case that was about 10mm thick, and I think sparked IWC's dive watch range in a way that I don't think has been had been seen before, rather. And of course IWC have become quite well known for their Aquatimer range. And this watch features a titanium 42mm case, which is 14.5mm thick, and features their safe dive bezel, which is a piece of technology which I find very, very impressive, because you can have a 2,000 metre watch, which, thanks to their gearing and mechanisms in the left-hand side of the case, where one might expect to see a helium escape valve, instead what one sees is a small lump in the case, which is where the gearing for this is housed. And this means that one can turn the external bezel bidirectionally. It turns freely in a clockwise way, but ratchets in an anti-clockwise way and turns the internal bezel, which means that you get a unidirectional bezel where there really is very, very little danger of, even if you do knock the bezel, there's very little danger of adjusting that internal bezel. And similarly, this is a bezel which works underwater, despite the fact that it actually goes through the case to control the internal bezel. Of course, this really is rather impressive when one combines this with the fact that the watch is a 2,000 metre diver, which does offer a watch which is a really impressive watch in terms of the functionality it offers, and in terms of the features it offers, in terms of its capabilities below sea level. And similarly, the case is designed very ergonomically to have an easily gripped bezel, as well as having a crown which sits relatively close to the case, though isn't protected by crown guards, and for its size, relatively short lug-to-lug distance, which again matches with the tool aspect of this watch. Now, this watch is a limited edition of 350 pieces, as a limited edition piece to commemorate this 35th anniversary, and the price for this watch is $7,400. And this is where I feel that there is a bit of a problem with IWC's decision, I think, with regards to the movement of this watch. This watch features an ETA 2892-A2, and I must say I really would expect better from IWC for this price, because I do feel that really with their watches which cost, say, $3,000 or $4,000, or indeed £3,000 or £4,000, one can accept the movement may not be one of their most high-end in-house movements, but at this price point one would expect more. That said, besides, this watch is a very impressive package and certainly is an interesting release from IWC this month. Now, the next watch I'd like to talk about has been talked about a great deal, and this is the new Patek Philippe Calatrava Pilot 5522A. And the A in that name does mean that this watch is a steel timepiece, and that's as a result of acier being the word in French for steel. And this is a watch which, on the face of it, seems like it's a very, very simple watch, considering its price of $21,547. But in terms of the quality of this watch and the finishing, I think Patek Philippe really have done an extremely good job, and I suspect these watches will sell extremely well. And this is a limited edition of 600 pieces, all selling each for that $21,547 mark, which is, and I give the price in dollars for the reason that these watches are only going to be sold in the US. There are 600 of these made, and they've been distributed among 89 different US distributors. So as a result, these watches are going to be pretty scarce in each area. But they offer a rather beautiful package, especially in that dial, which is a lacquer dial with a slightly metallic and iridescent quality, giving it that blue sheen, which I think matches those hands extremely well, which are those thermally blued hands, with a painted second hand with a pip on the end, giving it greater legibility. And of course, those cathedral sword-style hands are fully loomed, along with the dial along on those indices, with a wonderful quality of loom application which bulges slightly over the top and gives a really fantastic, insight into the quality going into these watches. And this watch also has a very clear and clutter-free dial with a simple Patek Philippe Genève and then Swiss made on it. And this complements the railway track style of minute markers around the edge of the dial extremely well in that white, which gives a pseudo monochromatic dial, which I think is typical of the brand in their rather understated form in their Calatrava line, to which this watch belongs. Now, internally, this watch is very typical Patek Philippe with the caliber 324S, and the 324 line of calibers are used very extensively throughout their lines, with both, for instance, the Nautilus, and indeed the watch this watch, I suppose, pays slight homage to, the Travel Time Pilot Calatrava, which comes in its 18-carat white gold case with its much more complex movement and much more complex dial design, which comes in at just shy of £50,000. So a much higher price point to this watch, though nonetheless this watch is not an insignificant sum of money, of course. But of course this movement is a very well-used movement and is seen in a great deal of different Patek Philippe watches, with its gold rotor and beautiful finishing. And in typical Patek Philippe form, there's no writing on the case back of this watch, meaning that the only writing on the watch really is that dial writing, which I must say I really do like. I'm not really one for extensive case inscriptions, so I must say I do like the simplicity of this watch. And the movement, of course, does have a degree of complication in it, in that it has their Gyromax balance, as well as their Spiromax balance spring, which is effectively silicon. And of course it has their 45-hour power reserve, which does give this watch a great degree of innovation. Of course, Patek Philippe movements are beautifully made and are very carefully assembled, which does add to the value of this timepiece. Now, one touch on this watch which I thought was very neat and very nicely considered is the Clovis-style buckle, which is said to resemble the belt buckles on pilot survival kits, on that rather lovely tan leather strap, which I think matches this watch down to the ground. So I must say I really am very, very fond of this watch in terms of its design and aesthetic, because it does represent a very elegant, typically Patek Philippe approach to a pilot's watch, which isn't too complicated and simply fulfills the functions that one would need in that era. So I must say I do like this watch a great deal, though I do feel that the pricing of Patek Philippe's is incredible for a steel watch. But mind you, these watches I'm sure no doubt will sell extremely well. Now the next watch I'd like to talk about is a new IWC, and this is the first Tourbillon version of their Portofino line to be released, and this is the new Portofino hand-wound Tourbillon Retrograde. And this is a watch which I think offers a great deal for the price that it costs, and I wouldn't normally say this for a $64,000 watch. But the reason I say this is because this watch does offer complications at a price which one would not normally see. Now IWC have done a very good job of preventing this watch from looking too ostentatious by effectively offsetting the 45mm 18-carat red gold case with this beautiful metallic white dial, which offsets those hands and those 18-carat red gold indices very, very well. Of course, additionally, one has three complications really on the dial. One has the power reserve at the 9 o'clock position in a very small setup, along with a larger pointer date, which is in fact a retrograde style, so it jumps back to 1 after 31st day of the month. And then one has the large flying tourbillon at 6 o'clock, which is really the most major talking part of this watch, because it has several complications on it which aren't normal for a tourbillon and certainly are difficult to make, and similarly which are almost first times for IWC. The most notable of which being the fact that it has a stop-second tourbillon, so you can set the seconds very, very precisely, which is rather rare for a tourbillon complication. Now, the view of the caliber 59900 through the caseback is really a wonderful sight to behold, with decorated bridges everywhere, and a 40 jewel movement with that wonderful medallion in the centre, which I think really does frame it beautifully. And of course, one can't see the tourbillon through the back of the watch, but one can see a great deal of the keyless drive of the watch, and indeed the spring barrel as well, via the cut-out bridges which are shown here, and decorated with blued screws and those exposed jewels, which really do add to the beauty of this watch as far as a technological masterpiece goes. Because I must say that the technology going into this watch is very impressive, with aspects such as the diamond-coated silicon pallet fork and escape wheel, which allow the watch to be much, much less sensitive to temperature fluctuation, and more resilient in general, which is not something one would normally be able to say for a watch of such ornate finishing and beauty. Anyway, though, I'll conclude this video here, but please do give me your thoughts on these watches in the comments down below, and also on Snups at the Watch Guys. So thank you very much for watching. Do please like, share and subscribe if you did enjoy the video and would like to see more content in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Sam on the Watch Guy, over and out.